The narrative genre is a mode of expository writing in which the writer is going to encapsulate her experience as it pertains to one particular, very narrow and refined topic. One of the primary differences between a narrative and, say, an autobiography is that an autobiography might span a person's lifetime or a longer length of time and be much broader in scope, whereas a narrative is going to focus in on perhaps a particular episode, one particular episode, or a particular feeling, or a particular idea, rather than stretching out along a person's entire life. A narrative also is going to be focused on making a critical point about the topic to which the experience is related. A literacy narrative is just like a narrative, so everything that you've learned about a narrative applies to a literacy narrative. The difference is that a literacy narrative, the topic is centered on your literacy experiences. So what that means is you'll want to decide on a topic or experience that is related to reading, writing, learning. Those are all broad, and of course you'll want to narrow that down to something more specific within those broader topics. But a literacy narrative is going to be centered on your experience with literacy. The first thing to consider when drafting a literacy narrative is to think about a precise episode, sensation, experience that you can relate to some broader topic about literacy. I don't want students to come and write a narrative that spans their entire educational career, right? From elementary school through high school, or even a couple months of that. Rather, choose to home in on one very specific incident or episode or situation that you can use to illustrate some larger points that you want to make about the literacy topic that you choose. So one of the first things that I ask students to do when they're drafting a literacy narrative is to identify a very specific topic that they wish to write about, and to narrow down all their experiences to one scene or one episode, one moment in their life that they can narrate. The first thing to consider which grammatical person or pronouns that you engage in your narrative is up to you stylistically. However, oftentimes students really overuse the pronoun I when they're writing a narrative. On one hand, that makes a lot of sense. You're writing about your personal experiences, and when you do that, you're speaking about yourself. This is one situation in the academic span of genres where using I is expected. So whenever you're discussing yourself and what you've experienced, using I is appropriate. However, in this narrative, you have to keep an eye on overuse of any word or concept. And that goes for I too. As you're writing your narrative, think about when using I makes sense, meaning that the sentence topic is actually you. Right? If the sentence topic is actually a different subject, such as reading, you want to make sure that you highlight that as the central focus of the sentence. So whenever you can take the emphasis off of, I did this, I felt this, and put it on, for example, the emotion itself, highlight that, you can actually write I out of your narrative. Sometimes that's a great approach to take to narrative writing. Your literacy narrative is, in some ways, a story. Whenever anybody illustrates their experience, essentially, they're telling a story about themselves. Keep this in mind when you write your literacy narrative. Every good story has a plot, and a plot is driven by the overall goal of the piece. So a plot is, what happens in the story. Think about what's happened to you that can help you illustrate a point that you want to make about literacy, some aspect of literacy that you feel is important. So when you illustrate your plot, think about the scenes of that plot. And again, these scenes should be focused on one very clear experience that you've had, and not your whole life or not your whole educational experience, right? One very particular moment. What's the story behind this moment? See if you can illustrate that and use a lot of pathos. Speaking of pathos, pathos is the primary appeal that we're practicing when you're writing a literacy narrative. It's the appeal that applies to the emotions. And we've already unpacked many strategies that you can engage in your writing to enhance your pathos and your appeal to the emotional sensibilities. When you're writing your narrative, think about how you can engage. Every story has characters, and your narrative is essentially, at its crux, a story. You yourself are a character in your story, and anybody else who appears, even for a short moment in your narrative, is also a character. Since this genre is so focused on pathos, think about how you can bring your characters to life. Even a little bit of detail goes a long way in this genre. So think about how you can flesh out your characters, including yourself. When it comes to academic writing in every subgenre, even a literacy narrative, there's always an argument at the heart of the inquiry. So for example, you're not writing a narrative just to tell a story about who you are. Although that's part of the genre, the real motivation behind the genre, the subgenre of a literacy narrative is to make an argument. In this case, your argument is going to be centered on literacy and some aspect that's very specific to your narrative concerning literacy. What is the argument that you want to use your experience to make? Make sure that in your narrative this is clear, it's highlighted, and that the experiences that you include are clearly connected to that argument. You want to make a point about literacy, something that you want to draw attention to that needs to change, or that's wonderful, or that's complicated, whatever it is concerning literacy. You're using here your experience to drive this argument home. Narrative serves a function. Make sure you know what your function is. Finally, one of the best ways to write an essay in any genre is to look at a lot of examples. There are many examples of literacy narratives out there that are fantastic fantastic. Some of these you'll find in our course, and I encourage you to go ahead and browse or skim them all. Take in what this genre does. Familiarize yourself with the key moves of the genre. The best way to write in any genre is to expose yourself to the genre. So get out there, find those literacy